So another opportunity for a public event as part of this forum is the PEN lecture, the PEN Cymru lecture this afternoon, presented by Joe Glanville of English PEN, and that will be at 4:15 am chwarter wedi pedwar. Felly, heb ragor gen I, dwi am drosglwyddo nawr at yr athro Enwyn Thomas ac at Patrick McGuinness ar gyfer y ddarlith hon. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi. Thank you very much. I'll explain in a minute why I'm here. Ond gyntaf, ga I ddymuno penblwydd hapus iawn I lenyddiaeth ar draws ffiniau, achos wy'n casglu bod chi'n dathlu eich 15fed penblwydd leni. A hefyd llongyfarch chi ar drefnu fforwm trawsffynio fel hon am natblygu cynulleidfaoedd. Gan bod i'n gadeirydd y cyngor llyfrau, rwy'n ymwybodol iawn wrth gwrs o'r her yma o geisio datblygu cynulleidfa newydd. Mae'n her mae'r cyngor yn gorfod I wynebu yn weinyddiol ar y cyd a diwydiant llyfrau yn ei gyfanrwydd yn awduron anwys ac yn lyfrferthwyr. Ac yn ystod y 10 mlynedd a mwy rwy wedi bod wrth y lliw fel cadeirydd, fe fi'n rhaid i'r cyngor a phob un o'n cleientiau ni ymyrasu'n yn gysol mwyn cyrraedd y nod. Felly fe redw i'n gwerthfawrogi'r gynhadledd gydwladol ar oesol hon yn ddirfaw, ac rwy'n gweld cyfarwyddwr y cyngor fan yn y cefen elwyr yn gwybod I fod wedi mynd chi sawl sesiwn ac wedi elwa o'r trafodaethau. My name is Wyn Thomas. I'm here to represent the Learned Society of Wales. And that's the body that is sponsoring this lecture and also, equally importantly, sponsoring the wide reception that follows. The Society is Wales's National Academy of Scholarship and of Learning. It consists of a body of scholars, currently some 300 in number, elected by their peers in recognition of their outstanding contribution to scholarship. It's a society that embraces all disciplines, not just the arts and humanities and social sciences, but also the sciences and engineering and medicine. And in recognition of its national and international status, it was recently awarded a Royal Charter. I am pleased to be able to chair this morning's lecture, not only because Professor Patrick McGuinness is, I'm pleased to say, a fellow of the Learned Society, but also because he's a good friend of mine. And it's good to be given a chance to pin him down and corner him at long last. Because Patrick is endlessly fugitive and elusive, and he seems to me to live a vagabond existence after a louche fashion all his own. The flavour of his restless, creative personality, I always think of him as an Oxford academic only on sufferance and not by conviction, was well caught in a profile that appeared in the Daily Telegraph a few years ago, that I'm sure Patrick will recall. There was a photograph that was part of that piece, and beneath it there was a caption which read, "Patrick McGuinness, a poet and a novelist who is most at home elsewhere." And that neatly sums up Patrick as I know him. The piece then went on to describe the experience of visiting what can only be described as Patrick's squat in his Oxford College at St Anne's, where apparently there may still be a sofa on which there reposed a pile of clothes that Patrick, airily gesturing towards it, referred to as his temporary wardrobe. And during the course of the ensuing conversation, Patrick admitted he was totally reliant on trains, not just for his incessant travels, but actually because they provided him with the most congenial environment for writing. "If I lived in a country where the trains were on time," he commented, "I'd never get anything written." And that explains, of course, why he stays in the UK. I think he's stayed there for a while, yeah. Patrick, of course, was born to be a traveller. A physical traveller, but also a mental adventurer. You'll recall that famous sentence from Joseph Conrad's novella, heart of darkness, all Europe went into the making of Kurtz. But it took even more than Europe to make Patrick McGuinness, because he was born in Tunisia in 1968 to a Belgian mother and a Newcastle Irish father. He grew up in his beloved Belgium, but also in Venezuela and Iran. And then he went on to spend his gap year in Ceausescu's infamous Romania, an experience on which he drew to such notable effect when writing his Booker Prize-nominated novel, The Last 100 Days. And now, shape-shifter endlessly that he is an adopted Welshman, or rather a good Covey, is an inhabitant of Caernarfon. And he's also a respectable Oxford Don, professor of French and comparative literature, an acknowledged academic authority on such impeccably erudite subjects as the French symbolists and the controversial intellectuals of yesteryear on the French right. Then, not content to confine himself decently to his accredited subject, he's had the gall to put the rest of us who try to write about Welsh culture to shame by trespassing on our preserve and producing brilliant studies such as a critique of the exotic Welsh Argentinian late modernist poet Lynette Roberts, whose poems and journals he's impeccably edited. He's also edited the poetic John Ormond, an important poet of post-war Wales. As you'll gather, Patrick has been endowed with talents to a positively indecent degree. But if I had to sum him up in a single word, that word would probably be poet. Not only has he published two remarkable collections, The Canals of Mars and Jilted City, but it seems to me that he sifts every phrase he writes, in whatever medium, for the fine sieve of a distinctively poetic sensibility. His books are as well travelled as he himself is. They've been translated into innumerable languages. And who better than to deliver this morning's keynote lecture than Patrick, and his title appropriately is Other People's Countries, Tales of Literary and Cultural Belonging. Patrick.
It'll be very hard to follow that, but I'm going to try. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to spend about half of the session lecturing in a kind of darting around way about ideas to do with translation and what cultural belonging might mean, and then I'm going to actually read something from a book that I wrote called Other People's Countries, which paradoxically is really only about my own country. And what I hope to show by that really is that there is a way of going back home and going back to where one comes from that is perhaps more exotic, more endotic and more enriching than all the travels one might actually undertake. So in a sense, one has to have travelled in order to know how to go back home, and one needs to know how to stay at home and see what there is at home in order to know how to travel. I mean this in a very specific sense as well, that literatures from small countries need to be literatures that take themselves seriously first of all, because otherwise they can't expect anyone else to take them seriously. So you have to know what it is that's good and unique about yourself, and that means looking inwards properly, because people complain, people imagine that the large country must of necessity be more outward looking than the smaller one. In my experience, which is the only one I have, that's not true at all. It's often the other way around. The smaller country has different angles of vision. The smaller culture has different angles of vision. The smaller publishing house, the smaller cultural outfit has different and more angles of vision. So the best way to travel is to know how to stay at home, and that's what I'm going to look at today. I also have a really enormous lectern, which I feel is actually cutting me off from my audience. It's like a barricade. So I'm going to move it, and I'm going to speak like this. So I tend to begin most of my talks with grand and often untrue statements. First, because a grand statement is a good opener, and you've heard a grand statement, and you may even have heard an untrue one already, but there are more. If someone disagrees with you and thinks you're saying something that's not true, it at least shows they're listening. And it's a way of finding out, really, who's listening and making people listen. So you have to understand that a lot of what I'll say might seem odd or counterintuitive, and that's what I hope it will be. So we live in a culture where our high street contains dozens of restaurants from different parts of the world. Our supermarket aisles have world foods from all four corners of the globe. Even if you can have English food only, you still need the ketchup, the mustard, the pickles, and the various condiments that'll make it taste interesting. So already our habits of consumption are entirely international. And yet, our bookshops, our libraries, our mainstream publishers barely register the presence of the world outside. Outside what? Well, outside what the French call anglophonie, Anglophonia. I don't know if it exists in English, but it should. Our UK TV channels rarely screen anything with subtitles on, and our radio channels play no songs that aren't in English, unless it's Radio 3 in classical music, where by nature in opera you don't understand what anyone's saying anyway. So, in a sense, parts of our daily experience are totally crossed through, riveted, rifted with internationalism, and other parts of it are simply not. Now, there's an obvious reason for this, that it's much easier to eat than it is to read. But surely literature should travel better than food. It doesn't need packaging, or at least it does, and I'll come into that in the metaphorical sense later. It doesn't go off or start to smell. Maybe the ideas do, but that's the point in a sense. And when you've consumed it, you don't have to go and evacuate to make room for the next one. So in a sense, the big question about why we aren't reading from across the world, and in fact in many ways it ought to be easier than the other things we do, is the question. What is the problem? Making literature travel is the byline for what Literature Across Frontiers and various other organisations, some of which represented here, do. It's also what we as people interested in the arts would like to do. So I want to think about the idea of travel in that context, moving around. Cultural curiosity is a very difficult thing to rely on, and it's certainly a fickle and undependable ally. It's also one that has little by way of predictable results. The fashion, for instance, for Scandinavian crime that began with Henning Mankell has been hugely enriching, but it hasn't extended to a hunger for, say, Scandinavian poetry. You might say that very little, sadly, seems to translate into a hunger for poetry of any sort, and that is a terrible pity. But it doesn't even translate more generally, necessarily, to contemporary fiction, though it has led to a huge expansion of Scandinavian thrillers being produced both there and translated in Britain and the US, Australia and Canada. What I've just said there is slightly untrue. It's sufficiently untrue, I hope, to make you think about something, namely that a great deal of the most exciting fiction and poetry, but note, I'm thinking specifically of fiction today, is published by the small independent publisher. And not only is it published by the small independent publisher, it's promoted, or you could say vehiculated. I don't know why I used that word. I saw it and I thought I should give it a go. So this is the first outing of the word vehiculated in my speaking career. Vehiculated by small independent bookshops. A great deal of our interesting international, what would you call it, relationship, is actually being carried out by the small. All literature can travel, but only some does. And you all know better than me the depressing statistics about how much translation is read in Britain and the States, and I won't go into that here. What does, however, seem to be true is that things are marginally better now, certainly in the UK, than they were 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. This is for the two reasons I've outlined: the rebirth of small publishers, perhaps finding that what used to be costly marketing is actually now cheaper and sometimes even free thanks to social media, and the rebirth of the independent bookshop with their own very sort of vision. I should be careful here. I say rebirth of independent bookshops and independent publishers. This is a rebirth predicated essentially on a large-scale death that's been going on for a while. So these are green shoots, yeah. I don't want anyone to get sick, okay? This is Aberystwyth. We need to stay kind of close to the ground here. But there are things to feel not unhappy about. If I think of the biggest single thing that's changed in the translation culture in Britain in the last few years, it's specifically that: new bookshops, new publishers. So in that sense, the future is small as well. There should be an alliance of smallnesses. Now, I know that's not the most catchy slogan, but I think that is what's happening. It's a series of small institutions, small outfits, small kind of nuclei getting together and, as it were, travelling and meeting each other, but without having to go through the airspace, as it were, of the mainstream, of the large, of the oblivious large, incidentally. It's still a precarious life, of course, as anyone who runs a publisher knows. There is a that I was told by Michael Schmidt, which may not be a joke. In fact, it's not a joke, factually speaking. Michael Schmidt at Carcanet, who for years has been publishing fantastic poetry in translation, he said to me, "How do you make a small fortune in publishing?" The answer, which you probably have already guessed, is begin with a large fortune. So there is this sense of inevitable loss, but there has to be a counter gain. And that gain is the huge amount of richness and dynamism one finds among the small and the independent. I was going to name them, but I'm not going to because I recognize some of the people from them here. But these publishers have been strugglers in the desert for a long time. And the rewards, I think, are quite slim. But smallness has many, many advantages, and I'm a big believer in the small. That being small is, in terms of vision, as I said earlier, an advantage. That you see the world from a different angle, that you somehow look up and you see more of the world. Your vision is, as it were, horizontal rather than vertical. The large country or the large culture is always somehow looking down. You know, it's looking down the, what would you say, down the shirt front of the world. Whereas perhaps the smaller culture, looking up that way, is looking up the shirt front. What a strange thought, of the world. But somehow you see more. And it also helps you see, in terms of marketing, in terms of what you might do, the world from a different angle. The angle which it hasn't been given to you from before. I said that I could disagree with it. In that sense, what I have to say is cautiously optimistic, because as my day job is being a modern languages tutor, I'm very often pessimistic, and there is a huge amount to be pessimistic about. I'll give you a quick run through to keep your feet on the ground. My subject, French, is apparently on the decline in UK universities because it's no longer being taught in schools and no longer being taken up by students. Some of my colleagues in Russian, German, Spanish, Catalan, Basque, and other smaller languages, not that Spanish is small, but you know what I mean, are being cut or forced into early retirement. The days when you could find Dutch in a UK university are long gone as an undergraduate course. And the great universities of comparative literature, I'm thinking of University of East Anglia, for example, which had Scandinavian departments so good and so creative that they produced, you know, work on Ibsen and Strindberg and Knut Hamsun that was being read the world over. All that's gone, okay? So we're not going to get any help from universities. I think even Wynne knows this. Universities are not going to help. That's gone. So anyone who wants to remain optimistic, certainly in Britain, had better keep their eyes averted from the university system, and certainly the people who run them, because that's not where help is going to come from. We're also not necessarily going to get help from our governments of whatever hue. There was an extraordinary comment by one of the leading Conservative ministers, Michael Gove, who said something so baffling that in some strange way it can give rise to intelligent reflection. And this is what I'm going to attempt to do, okay? This is like tightrope walking, but mentally. It's like magic. I'm going to take a stupid comment and try to give it some intelligence. And it almost is magic. Michael Gove, minister, he said a few years ago when he was responsible for culture, he said that we should stop reading translations because it was bound to be less good than our own second-rate stuff. Now it has a kind of perfection to it, the way an egg is beautifully egg-shaped. This is perfectly stupidity-shaped. And yet, if you think about it, there's something going on here which at least bears analysis. It's the sense that in order, so it would be like somebody saying, I don't mind using alternative energy sources, but only when we've used up all the oil, okay? That's the analogy. We have to read all of our own stuff first, and then once we've finished, then we can start reading Tolstoy and stuff. And he actually uses Tolstoy because he says, however great Tolstoy is, because he's the modern right, okay, not the old right. So the modern right thinks that other people might possibly be quite good, and he doesn't exclude the possibility that other countries might have good things, okay? That's the new right. But he's still not interested, okay? The reason he's not interested is because this extraordinarily torturous comment where he says that even the second rate written in the original language will always be better than the brilliant translation. So do you see how I'm propping this up in order to make it sound like a challenging but potentially defensible position? Maybe. Now that actually made me start thinking in terms of translation as part of a sort of perceived cultural ecology. It's something you turn to after you finish with your own stuff, something that you do when you can't write your own stuff. It's essentially ascribing passivity to the act of translation and activity to one's own things. It's also, of course, a form of literary and cultural protectionism, which is something that we see in all kinds of cultures, not just ours, in Britain, I mean. But does it really have to be a contest between reading Tolstoy in the original Russian, or reading, say, a good second or third rate English language writer in the original? Tolstoy in translation, or who's third rate? Give me a quick number. Third rate but good, okay? Can you think of someone? Okay, second rate. Second rate but good. Okay, I'll tell you somebody I like very much, but who I think is probably not first rate, but I think he's great. Gissing. Second rate? Okay, thank you. Okay, Gissing in the original, who is... Actually, I can't say Gissing, because I think he's probably first rate. Goss, Edmund Goss, good, brilliant. Someone should write a book of the second rate, because it would actually not be a book about bad literature. It would be something about the huge importance of the secondary, which is where most of us, like it or not, finish up. So we should face up to it and own it, and write about the secondary. Edmund Goss, okay, Edmund Goss. Fathers and Sons he wrote, didn't he? Fathers and Sons, brilliant example of the second rate. in the original, is that better than Tolstoy in the best imaginable translation? Suddenly, my seriously, and for whom the expression seemed so well designed that it was impossible to imagine it being anything other than theirs. In truth, I had simply caught it for the length of its brief life in our language, and though I try sporadically to revive it in Bouillon or plant it further afield in the French-speaking world, all the dictionaries assure me it never existed. And yet, it seems a pity here, in this country whose great symbols are the mannequin piece, the only world tourist attraction that is smaller than most of the souvenirs that replicate it, and the baraque à frites, chip stall. A combination of the two would surely become, in turn, the very symbol of national disaster. T'as bien pissé dans tes frites, la vieux. You've well and truly pissed in your chips there, mate. And what I suppose I liked about that idea was that we spoke a French that didn't exist because my Anglo-Irish father had established himself in this very small Belgian town where if you used one phrase for long enough, it would ripple down and it would mean something. It's gone now, of course, much like the Wallon that my grandparents and great-grandparents spoke. But somehow I feel I'd like to kind of introduce it. I'd like to go through the Boulevard Saint-Germain and hear somebody say, "T'as pissé dans tes frites, la vieux," as if somehow it had escaped, you know, like somebody emigrating and starting a whole new scion of a family. But it hasn't happened yet. I am optimistic. In fact, I think if it's going to happen in one place, it'll happen in Montreal. This is called Trappist beer. This is our local Café du Centre. On one side of the bottle, on one side is a bottle of Westmaler, on the other a bottle of Orval. Both are Trappist beers. Westmaler is made in the north, in the Flemish province of Antwerp, Orval here in the south, in the Ardennes or in the Gaule, a few kilometres away from Bouillon. Both orders are Cistercian, though Westmaler is deemed a Flemish beer and Orval a Walloon beer. Here in Belgium, even a Trappist must choose the language in which to keep silent. So language, in a sense, has always been there. It's always been as part of... I'll read one more bit and then I'm going to stop. This is called The Arse. Monsieur Anus, you don't pronounce the H, but you do the S, and with gusto too, ran a cafe off Place Saint-Arnoux. No one can remember if they ever knew what his Christian name was. That's what having Anus as a surname does for you. By the traditional method of nickname contagion, his wife was known as Lanus. Chez Lanus, or chez le cul, the cafe was called, down the arse. And though it too had a perfectly good name of its own, no one ever invoked it. You couldn't blame them. Both Anus and his cafe became known as le cul, the arse, or in Wallon, le queue. Je vais chez le queue, my grandfather would say. Je vais chez le cul. I'm off down the arse. Every Wednesday and Sunday night. My grandmother, who when she remembered thought herself a bit above speaking dialect, would say to me around 10 or 11 o'clock, "Descends un peu chez le cul, tu veux, voir si Eugène y est. Pop down the arse, would you? See if Eugène is there." That's enough. Thank you.
Well, the game plan has just gone out of the window. The game plan, as Patrick suggested it, was that he would talk for some 20 minutes and then there would be 20 minutes of questions. Unfortunately, he lost his watch and I didn't have the sense to lend him one. So I'm in the hands of the organisers. It's actually 12:30, I see, which is when we're due to move on. But of course, I'd be delighted if it were felt that you could relax the schedule a little. Yeah? to allow for 5-10 minutes at least of exchange. Is that all right? Yeah. In that case, it's over to you. Yes, please.
Hang on a sec. I think there will be a microphone coming circulating.
Out of curiosity, I imagine that you read these poems in Belgium and in France. What was the audience's response?
Well, the French, the ones who take their bearings from Paris, are always slightly sort of snooty about the Belgians because they think the Belgians are an essentially comical race. That's because they're afraid of them. Because the Belgians exist to subvert the French and their pretensions, and to subvert all of the big French theories have been essentially taken down by the Belgians. And so the French quite like it because to them it's exotic. Although what's interesting is that wherever I read, France, Belgium, Ireland, Germany and so on, people always come and say, actually that's just like the place I lived in. That's where I was brought up. And I suppose my feeling is that this very small book is about community and of the sort that you get in every place. You know, you get the town liar, you get the town libertine. Ours in Bouillon was called Zizi, rather unimaginatively. And you get the town raconteur, the town exaggerator, all of this. And if you've watched Places Decline, so I read this in Metz, actually, in France, which is a beautiful but quite clearly post-industrial town in the Lorraine, and they just said, well, that's basically like here. The Belgians quite like it because everywhere in Belgium is a bit like that. And when I say Belgians, I mean both the Walloons and the Flemish. So they recognize something in it. I'd like to think that the book is an experiment in what we all do at some level, which is the deeper we go into what we think makes us different from everyone else, the more we emerge into what makes us the same as everyone else. And I suppose that's what my talk was about too, that you can go out, but through the in path and under. You have to dig your way there rather than fly there. So, I mean, in my fantasies of being relevant and widely read, I imagine that this book is probably represents pretty shared experience wherever, really.
I'd be interested in hearing more about your experience of being translated. You wrote a novel set in Romania, which I know was translated into Romanian. What was it like to jostle for attention, suddenly becoming part of a crowd of locally produced, using the Govian paradigm, locally produced books?
Well, being translated into Romanian was quite strange because my novel was about a pretty, pretty difficult, of course, period in Romanian history. It's about the last sort of 3 or 4 months before the revolution, and of course, I wasn't there, but I'd been there until just before, so I missed the revolution. If I'd been there, I wouldn't have written it. The whole point about literature is that it describes things that didn't happen, you know? My favorite quotation about writing is Mallarmé, who says, the world exists. What's the point in describing it? Okay, and at some level, you want to bear that in mind. Even if you are describing what exists, you have to do something extra to it. I was very conscious of writing about other people's very painful reality, which is why I invented a character who was removed from things, because I couldn't ethically put myself in a position where I imagined that I had experienced these quite traumatic events. When it was translated into Romania, it was sort of controversial, in the sense that some people thought it was some people read it as a true psychological portrait of what happens when you live with lies constantly, and that you can find your way to truth, which is what the book is about. But then you also had people who said, you know, he did not have the right to write this. This was a book that, you know, he doesn't know about, and it's our job to come to terms with our own trauma and history. I have no respect for that point of view at all, because taken logically it would mean nothing got written. So, you know, I have some respect for the sense of irritation, but as an intellectual position it's not in any way sustainable. And then you get the third category of person who says, well, on page 74 you said that there's a car factory. However, everyone knows the car factory shut 2 years before your novel. How do you expect to be taken seriously? And I don't have any respect for that either. But I mean, I am interested in the ethical question, and I think it's important it's important to try to find out how your book does abroad. But anyway, that's a very long way round of saying that being translated into a culture which you're writing about is of course different from a culture which doesn't know the stuff. The book had quite a lot of success in France as well, where they notoriously know very little about Romania but think they know a great deal. But I don't know. I don't know. Being translated is exciting and an honor, but it doesn't mean that you will get an audience, or that you'll get the right audience, or that the kind of people who read the original will read the translation. That's the other thing. The readership somehow transmogrifies